Good morning and welcome to the final part of our training on the intersection of long-term strategies, of transparency, and transportation. So we're very excited to have you back. And I see there are a few people who are still rolling in, which is great. It's been, whoops, hold on, they're pinging me. I'm just going, Ben. Hi, Simia. Hi, Abdur. Welcome.
Hi,
So
good morning to you.
good morning. We're very excited to have everyone back, and it's been a wonderful journey to spend this with you to go through all this training. So we're very excited to kind of wrap up today and have a very interactive session later today to talk about, what's next as far as long-term strategies go. So I have with me, as usual, the team from the LTS team, Howard and Logan and Nayel, and then Nicola from Slowcat is also back with us today. So that's a little bit of a treat. And good morning, ATM. Welcome. All right.
Good morning.
Good morning. All right. So maybe we can just get started. There's a lot of content that we want to get through, and we want to hear a lot from you now that we're in our last session about what some of these actions might be. So let's just get started with the agenda. Today, we're going to be starting with a quick recap of the key items from session 3. As you may recall, as we did the exercise in session 3 about thinking about the data needs and the modeling needs, there were some common issues that came up around data and around modeling. So we wanted to revisit a few of the most common items and talk a little bit about some of the solutions and some of the examples of how countries or organizations have worked around some of these potential barriers. After we do the recap, we will then discuss some of the long-term strategy and transparency building blocks. So, and what we mean by this is, what do we need to have in place to develop a long-term strategy? We will have then our group exercise. It's going to be a bit longer than our usual group today, just because we want to create opportunities for all of us to share and to discuss what some of the next steps on LTS development might be, and what can you do independently as an organization, or in the government, and what might you be able to accomplish if you had a little bit of assistance. So whether that be technical assistance or financial resources or something else that might help you. And then we'll close by reviewing some of the resources that are available that support LTS, and a few closing remarks at the end of today. Right. So by the end of today, we're hoping that you understand these building blocks that we're going to go through, that you become familiar with the process, the general steps to developing an LTS, and how you can improve that comprehensive LTS over time. And then by the end of it, I hope we can identify and prioritize some potential next steps in each of your circumstances. All right. I'm just skipping forward one more slide. Thank you, Logan. So yeah, we're our fourth one, developing an LTS action plan. So we've come a long way. We're on the last bit. And hopefully we'll come out of this with some helpful resources for you, as well as making some connections. There are, as I mentioned, a lot of organizations that are thinking about LTS and providing support. So as we identify needs, it would be great if we could try to figure out if there are some connections that we can make that might help you meet those needs. All right, so hopping into our session 3 review. As we discussed during our last session, the LTS development process is a continuous process, and this is something that should be supported by ongoing stakeholder engagement and then the documentation of data and assumptions. So we want to make sure that we're continually getting political and public buy-in into any LTS developments that we're doing, and communicating the data and assumptions that we're making in modeling and developing pathways. This information is useful for not just describing the information that we have on hand, but also communicating to future individuals or organizations that might be revising your LTS on kind of what improvements can be made. We talked a bit about modelings last session, and I think the punchline is that there's no one-size-fits-all model, and there's no perfect model that will give you what you need. It's always going to be a combination of what's available, what fits your capacity, what fits your data, and what suits your needs and your priorities. I know many countries face limited data or limited human resources, but that doesn't need to stop us from starting the LTS process, right? The idea of visioning and modeling can happen with limited data and with simple models, at least as a starting point. It's like the idea of not letting perfect be the enemy of the good. Getting started is a pretty good starting point, and you can use what you have. And then, as I noted, there were a few common challenges that were identified in our last session. We talked about local data issues. We talked about non-standard documentation, human resources, and weak or inadequate institutional arrangements to support LTS. And I think we're going to dig into that a little bit later in this section. And you may recall from our last session that we had this diagram about kind of what the key steps are for developing an LTS. There are many ways you can start with LTS. You can start either, what we call a top-down approach, where you have a goal and then you need to figure out what you need to do from a mitigation standpoint to reach your goal, or alternatively a bottom-up, where you're looking at all the transportation mitigation options that you might have in hand and trying to determine what goal is reasonable for you to achieve, what's sufficiently ambitious but also realistic. Either approach, top down or bottom up, would take these steps. You would need to determine your baseline, so what kind of emissions you would have if things continued as they were. You'd have to identify some of the mitigation options. So this refers to the ASI framework and some of the avoid, shift, and improve opportunities that that framework provides. And then using those, prioritizing those mitigation options, developing pathways, and then eventually implementing actions and monitoring and evaluating, which is a little bit outside the scope of just the strategy development. So this slide 9 in your deck, it's just a summary of some of the things we talked about as far as data needs and potential data sources. There's lots. This is just an example, but these are some of the common data needs that you might encounter when developing your baseline for your LTS and developing your mitigation pathways. There are lots of sources that you can leverage, many of them that exist within your country and some that might be international that you can use. So your national communications, your biennial update reports, and your national inventories will give you a good amount of information related to your historical emissions, and that's your starting point for also your projections. There are ministry documents and maybe legislative documents in your country that could tell you what the policy landscape is. So it defines what the next few years might look like, what your baseline, from this point would be. If you're projecting forward and you're thinking about what the future might look like, academic research and industry reports may give you some readouts about what the level of technology penetration might be. They might be able to give you some information on other countries that have adopted mitigation options and how successful the emission reductions were. So those are two other sources. And finally, if you are, struggling with data in your country, there are international sources that can provide you some information. So for example, the World Bank does have an open data set, which includes economic projections and population projections. And IPCC has information around greenhouse gas emissions that may or may not be applicable to your circumstances, or may be adoptable for your circumstances. So that is a very quick rundown of all of session 3, which took us about an hour and a half to do. I want to pivot a little bit to talk a little bit about the common challenges that were identified in the workshop. This is not going to be in depth, but hopefully this helps kind of get you thinking about some of the ways that you can adapt adapt to address these challenges when you go to think about doing your LTS. So one common challenge that came up was just having limited data available or limited local data available to support LTS analyses. And our team went back and we thought a bit about this and we identified a few potential solutions for your consideration. One, I think the lowest cost effort and approach that you could take, which is to be transparent and take on the transparency route. Use the data that you have available, but document your gaps when you're conducting your analysis and reporting that along with your analysis. This doesn't increase the granularity of your assessment. It doesn't make it more accurate, but it lets people know that it's not accurate. And also you can identify, like, in mind, if I was to redo this, I would improve X, Y, and Z. So areas for improvement. That would be one way you can work with what you have, but still move forward with coming up with a vision and trying to ballpark your pathways. Another option would be to look at available, maybe higher level data, whether it's international, national, and try to scale it down to your use. So for example, I know there are some folks on this call that work at the city level, right? And so you may not have information at the city level, but you may be able to take a larger or higher level data set and scale it down based on population, based on land area, based on some set of assumptions. Again, documenting that is how you got the data is one way of moving forward. Another approach when you have limited data or limited availability would be to really focus in on where you're going to improve your data. Looking at all the data that you might need, it's very daunting. It requires a lot of resources, a lot of time, and a lot of people to address all your data collection needs. But if you have some priority mitigation actions or you have some priority emission sources, you can focus on improving the data just for that one component to start. So for example, I think Thailand and I can't remember, I think another country had noted that electric vehicles were going to be an important part of their future. You might want to just focus on improving the data collection around EVs, around either EV penetration or doing some academic research. And that doesn't solve your whole problem, but it solves a big part of your problem. And then a fourth option might be to consider alternative methods for data collection. And this actually came up during one of the workshops, one of the breakout groups, where Bangladesh had noted, I think it was Abdur noted that Bangladesh's greenhouse gas inventory, they were relying on satellite data because it was a source of information that they could get that was more reliable than maybe the alternative. And I think I saw Abdur jump on the line. I think I said hello to him. Are you there, Abdur?
Yes, I'm listening.
Hi. I believe you brought up this example about what Bangladesh is doing. Are you willing to speak a little bit more to this example and maybe elaborate for everyone on the call?
Sure. Thank you. Actually, Bangladesh, from the government level, is still now not doing any research, but NGOs are doing something in this field. I actually mentioned the way we can acquire data for GHG emission measurement. The available options for our country could be satellite data, which can be acquired from USGS Earth Explorer website, which is totally free. But if I want to mention a few options that can be easily available based on the situation, like developing country like us who don't have available options in the past. The main option could be, for example, NOVA AHRR, then MODIS satellite imagery, Landsat MSS, Landsat TM, Landsat ETM, Spot IRS, Aster ERS, RadarSat DMC, and for high resolution data, the data we can get from actually aerial photography. But aerial photography actually is very new term. So it's not available for the past data. And at last, for very high resolution data, ESA, ERSA, and NASDA, NVSAID, this type of satellite imagery are available. But for specifically GHG emission data, uh, mainly for carbon dioxide and methane, there is a satellite uh, which is called NADIR, um, which was launched for IPCC GHG observation. But I would like to say that how can this data can be used for monitoring GHG emission? Based on image classification, this data can be analyzed through NDVI, which is normalized vegetation index, and normalized water index, NDWI, using different software like NV, ArcGIS, or QGIS. QGIS is open source, so it can be used by anyone. But the main problem in this respect is the accuracy, because the overall accuracy might be not more than 90%. As using Landsat 8 data, we got accuracy as a kappa coefficient of 88.6% and 0.8311% for calculating carbon dioxide emission, which is a major component of GHG gas. So for the time period of 2014 to 2016 period. So in brief, it is possible to calculate carbon dioxide, nitric oxide, and the major components of GHG gases from satellite imagery, but actually it has less accuracy as compared to the modern methods of obtaining GHG data. Thank you. Actually, these are the brief of what I have known about this. Thank you, Darina.
Thank you, Abdur. I mean, that's a lot of information. I think you raised some really good points there about leveraging open source, but some of the limitations that exist there. I just want to pause. Does anyone have any questions for Abdur before we move on? Okay, great. And I think, Abdur, you mentioned quite a number of resources and of data sets and of sources. I think what we're going to do is we'll try to just pull that list, because I think you said it very quickly. We can pull that list and we can share it with the group for anyone else who's interested in that information and exploring that a little bit further.
Sure.
Great, thank you. All right. So Logan, yep, thank you. Thank you for moving that forward. So another challenge that came up during our last session was this idea of data documentation and processes that were just asynchronous. They were not standardized, and it's really hard to compare different data that was coming from different places. I think I saw Nebedita had mentioned that for India, or for one of the data sets in one of the examples. And I'm sorry if I've got the wrong person. I just remember seeing that in one of the exercises. Some of the solutions, or some of the ways that we can work with or around this challenge, would be again, transparency, documenting your non-standardized data and acknowledging the potential gaps and the potential issues with your analysis. If you put that information out there, or you use that data without that context, it's challenging and it's not very accurate. But if you provide that context and that transparency, that's a starting point. And again, it gives the analysis a little bit more a fuller picture. Another option would be to work with your data owners or your data users to identify common methods and protocols that could be adopted across the board. And this is an example from a project that I've been working on, not in Asia, but in Latin America. So with Colombia, and this is actually a transport example, there were a few government agencies that were working on kind of understanding the vehicle fleet, like what the fleets look like in Colombia. But the classification used for vehicles varied depending on which agency. So from the greenhouse gas accounting perspective, there's one way of classifying vehicles, and then a different agency was classifying vehicles slightly differently. So there was from each agency, the data was different, and when it was passed back and forth, it was not directly usable. And the way that the Colombians are addressing it is that they've started to organize technical working groups with representatives from these different agencies to try to come up with a common approach and to move forward where they're using the same classification and using a standardized approach to classifying their data. And it's a lot of work right up front, but in the long run, it's easier because the information can be shared between the uses much more easily. Another way you can address this challenge would be to adjust data to account for non-comparability. So a simple greenhouse gas example might be if you have data and you're using different global warming potentials or different emission factors. You may be able to disaggregate that and adjust for the data to use the same factors or the same GWP. But that may or may not be possible in all cases. That would be one approach, but it would depend on your data. And then finally, just a reminder, document your uncertainties, your limitations, and any adjustments. That's another way of dealing with that. Another common challenge that came up was just fundamentally that there aren't enough people. There are not enough staff to get all the things that need to be done, or there's not enough technical knowledge, or some combination of that. Some potential solutions or some potential ways to address this would be to, one, focus your available human resources, available technical staff on long-term strategy tasks that are most actionable, maybe have the most co-benefits and might just benefit other activities as well, as a starting point, right? And I think this is generally a prioritization exercise, which many of us do anyway, but focusing your resources on the highest impact activities. Another option would be, and we raised this, I think, a little bit in session 3, was leveraging local nonprofits or universities and research institutions to help support parts of the long-term modeling activities. And there's some benefits to this beyond just having more resources that might be supporting the national effort. With universities and embedding kind of that capability in universities, in a lot of ways, it could be more robust, where there's lower political impact. So if there's a changeover in government, that there may not be a big changeover in staff. And also it creates a curriculum, and it creates a place for developing students and their capabilities and kind of building out a country's capacity with more climate professionals. So that's a consideration. And as we mentioned, Latin America, there's a little bit more of that happening as a starting point, where there's pairing of institutions and embedding modeling capabilities within universities. Finally, as some of you may be familiar with, there are donors who are augmenting, who are taking the path of augmenting country staff, ministry staff, with secondments. That is, embedding technical experts as part of the permanent staff of a country. So we've seen some of that from for some of my projects with the UK government, where they're just adding staff to address immediate needs. And that's something that might be a path forward in the future. And then moving on to the next slide, there is the age-old challenge of institutional arrangements. When you do not have established systems or agreements for data sharing, for modeling, that is really fundamental to supporting something like a long-term strategy. I believe Gopal had raised this in session 2 or session 3, that this is an issue that we've faced for a very long time for inventory development, for example. And that's how information gets lost, why aren't sustainable. This is a challenge that we face. It's not an easy challenge, and we may not solve it just for LTS, but there are steps that can be taken And I want to highlight a couple of resources. So the US EPA has developed this National Inventory System toolkit, which has documentation and structures and recommendations and steps for how you develop institutional arrangements. And this has been applied for over a decade, and it's freely available online as a resource. It also has other resources such as templates for developing effective memorandums of understandings or memorandums of agreement for data sharing. So it has draft text that's available in multiple languages that you can use as a starting point for figuring out how to share data and like what that language might look like. Because sometimes that's hard to develop if you've never seen one before. So those links are available in this PowerPoint. And if anyone has questions about it, our team was part of the development. And we're happy to answer questions and share that with you. Okay. So I'm going to pause there. That's enough about session 3. I hope that's useful. And certainly if you have questions about that, please drop them in the chat and we can come back to it. But I'm going to take this time to just pivot and pass the mic to Logan to talk a little bit more about the building blocks.
Great, thanks, Darina. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the building blocks of transparency and LTS, and this will incorporate some of what Darina mentioned and also recap a little bit of what we talked about in session 1 and session 2. It's kind of a synthesizing and reframing of what we've learned in the past and kind of builds out how we're going to develop LTS up. So I recall this diagram from the first session. These are the key elements of an LTS. Remember, there are 6, but not every LTS includes each one, and there are varying levels of detail or robustness for each of these elements. But just as a reminder, you have the long-term vision or goal, which pretty much every LTS is going to have. And then you will have greenhouse gas reduction targets. You'll have potentially some adaptation objectives. And then you'll also have some implementation pathways, some monitoring and improvement processes, and some sectoral objectives. And then there's also some elements of transparency. Just like with LTS, however, we didn't explicitly talk about these in the past, so we just wanted to mention some of these principles, kind of adopting what the UN promotes. These principles are known as a collective group called TAC, and that stands for transparency, accuracy, consistency, comparability, and completeness. So let's go through those one at a time. You've heard about transparency. I think most people are on the same page with this now. It's clearly documenting and explaining your methodologies and your data in a manner that other people understand what you did and how you did it. The second principle is accuracy, and this is making sure that your data is as precise and as exact as possible, and that you've minimized uncertainty as much as possible. You may still have some uncertainty, but the point is that you've tried to minimize it. And then there's consistency, and that's using the same methodology, the same time series, the same factors, all of those components of creating an inventory or an LTS, you've done consistently throughout the process. Then the fourth principle is comparability, and that's typically on a national level or an international level, but it can be on a subnational level, and it's where countries and governments report data in a similar format and use the same metrics, and that way there's an apples to apples comparison across the board, where everybody's on the same playing field. And then finally, there's completeness, and that's the idea that you've filled in the data for every category, every sector, every geography. You've made sure that you filled all the gaps and they're addressed. If you're interested in these principles, that we have included a couple of links here in the PowerPoint. There's a really good UN guide especially for greenhouse gas inventory practitioners. And then there's another great guide from GIZ for those folks that are just getting started and looking at some of these elements. So with that, kind of taking that into account, we're presenting these 6 building blocks here. And you can kind of think of this it's analogous to the top down and the bottom up typologies of LTS, where you're going to be starting typically with a goal at the top. Every LTS is going to have a goal or a vision, but then to actually achieve that goal, you're going to have to implement some actions and some processes to achieve it. And so this is where the mitigation and adaptation strategies come into play. And then also there's a monitoring and improvement process on the back end where you're looking at the progress of those strategies and how they're proceeding and how they're moving forward towards the goal. And then below that, there's these three kind of foundational resources that help support the implementation process. And we've called them resources, which you can think of as all resources, whether that's financing, whether that's human capacity, whether it's technical capacity, any kind of resources that are needed to actually put a plan into action. And then supporting that idea is these institutional arrangements, which we talked about some of the challenges. It's a key building block to effectively implementing these, where you're going to make sure that agencies are talking to one another, making sure that you're consistently using the same language and definitions, and everybody knows what their roles and responsibilities are. And then the third foundational resource is these data and models. So all the data sets, all the models, all the methodologies that you use going into supporting the development and the monitoring of the strategies. So these are the 6 building blocks, which we are going to look at in more detail when we get to the group exercise, but also into the next section. But before I get ahead of myself, we also want to mention the importance of transparency and stakeholder engagement in the building blocks. You can think of transparency and stakeholder engagement as cross-cutting principles, very similar to how in the development diagram that we have for the LTS, we talked about how stakeholder engagement and transparency are kind of infused and incorporated into all those steps. And the same is true here. Where you're going to include transparency and stakeholder engagement in all of these blocks. Some might dominate, or in some cases, one might dominate the other. For instance, data and models, that's going to be a lot more about transparency than about stakeholder engagement. But you could reach out to stakeholders to find data sets to get advice on which are most up to date or most applicable, things like that. So in any building block, you'll find both of these cross-cutting principles. So that's kind of setting the foundation, and Howard is going to talk about how to build up your LTS using those building blocks.
Great, thanks, Logan. So as Logan was noting, there are a number of fundamental building blocks for LTS and transparency development. But as we've repeated before, it's important to note that LTSs do not need to include necessarily every single element of these building blocks or the components we've discussed earlier in their initial iterations. And often there are variations in LTSs that exist depending on the capabilities and resources of the countries that have developed them. But alternatively, LTS comprehensiveness can be built up over time as countries increase their expertise or their existing capacity. In this model image at the bottom of this slide, you'll see there's 3 levels of LTS ranging from the base version through the intermediate version, and then finally concluding with the detailed version. These 3 examples illustrate how LTS comprehensiveness can be built up over time. We'll go into more detail in the following slides, but put simply, the base version of an LTS will be including a long-term goal or vision that might be relatively general. Moving to an intermediate version, you'll see a refinement of this goal while adding specific GHG reduction targets and sector objectives, as well as being supported by quantitative data that's initially developed. Finally, concluding with the detailed version, these long-term goals and GHG reduction targets will be further refined and complemented with comprehensive implementation plans and monitoring and improvement processes for further LTS goal setting and refinement. When building up an LTS, it's important to consider the existing capacities, resources, and the national priorities of the countries that these LTSs are being developed in. It's also important to note that LTS improvements and the expansion of their comprehensiveness can be paired with regular revisions to other planning exercises, such as NDC updates and revisions. In the image you see on the right, you start with a base version associated with an NDC to 2030, and then with subsequent NDC updates in 2035 and in 2040, you can add refinement through an intermediate version and a detailed version. The benefit of this is that the development of LTS by being paired with NDC updates are that it can leverage analysis and modeling exercises used for that NDC analysis to complement any LTS activities. Additionally, an NDC may include mitigation or adaptation activities that could be further incorporated in the LTS for its development. Breaking these types of LTSs down in a little bit more detail, the image on the left indicates when one of these building blocks will be incorporated into the version of the LTS that we're looking at. So in this base version, as I noted earlier, a simple vision to pursue sustainable and low carbon development with a general goal towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 is included. Looking ahead to an intermediate version, as I mentioned earlier, a further refinement of the greenhouse gas emissions goal, in this case, a quantified goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 is included. This could, for example, be reducing greenhouse gas emissions by a certain % by 2050 or compared to a business as usual scenario by 2050. Complementing this, mitigation and adaptation strategies will be defined in this intermediate version. This could include topics we've covered such as vehicle fuel efficiency or electrification or infrastructure resiliency in the case of adaptation strategies. To complement and to build these GHG targets and mitigation and adaptation strategies, countries in the intermediate version LTS will start to leverage some national data and also international data sets to support quantification. Additionally, initial resources such as human capacity, as well as early institutional arrangements or relatively informal institutional arrangements can be developed to support LTS. Turning to the detailed version, you can see that this builds on the intermediate version while adding more refinement. In the image on the left, 2 checkboxes indicate when building blocks are expanded on from the intermediate version in this new and refined LTS. The key points of a detailed version of an LTS are the inclusion of an implementation plan, which will specify specific mitigation targets and include, for example, specific project funding. Additional country-specific data will also be leveraged in the detailed plan to further quantify and specify LTS goals and mitigation strategies and targets. An additional feature of a detailed version will be a monitoring and improvement plan, and this will both track the progress of an LTS and facilitate updates to LTS targets, which can be consistent with NDC revisions over a 5-year period. Lastly, institutional arrangements under this detailed version are further formalized, and this can include things that Dorina highlighted, such as memoranda of understanding and terms of reference between ministries that may support LTS activities. So this simply refines and more formally puts those arrangements in this detailed version. So as you can see from this image here, there are multiple building blocks that are built up over time and refined as you're moving from the base version through the intermediate version and the detailed version. And these building blocks and their refinement can again be prioritized what countries' priorities are, as well as their existing capacity to expand and refine those building blocks, whether that be technical or human resources based.
So, I know that was a challenging and kind of a big exercise. We don't, hi Jacobon, welcome back. I know we don't have a ton of time left, so maybe what we could do is I could throw to each group, and maybe the group lead can speak to a few highlights, and then if anyone else in the group would like to add to it, they can jump in. How's that? So maybe Logan and Nicola, if you guys want to start off with your group.
Yeah, so we had a good group. We worked through the building blocks, and we found that for most of the actions identified for each of the building blocks, most of them were marked as high importance. So I don't think that's too surprising. The ones that came to mind first were of the highest importance. But in terms of like cost, they're kind of across the board, but more high and medium than low cost. We've also noted that most of the building blocks in most countries are at a basic level, though some are at an intermediate level, which is great to see that continued growth in the process. One thing that was interesting that came up, at least it was interesting to me, was that one of the mitigation actions that Thailand is implementing is this excise tax on cars, on selling new cars, and it's the fee depends on how carbon intensive they are. So the more carbon intensive vehicles have a higher fee, and then like lower intensity, like electric vehicles, have a very low fee. So Jacobon, I thought that was a great example. If you want to share a little bit with the group, I think that'd be really great. But no pressure if you don't care to.
Thank you, Logan. Just a little bit in detail of these measures. Thailand now we implement the excise tax based on the carbon emission since 2016, and it charged only for the private car for now. And normally the conventional fee for the excise tax for the internal combustion engine car is about 10 to 15%. But for high energy efficiency, such as the EV, electric vehicle, is lower to about 2 or maybe 0 in some model. Yeah. That we make the upfront price of the car is for the high energy efficiency, such as EV, is it can be compete with the conventional car, and the effect that we saw is the fuel economy consumption. The average fuel economy of the new car is better for the last few years, and that is impact to the people to choose the high energy efficiency car in Thailand for now, and we try to strengthen the standard, strengthen the standard of the emission that we will charge for the excise tax in the future. That will make the average fuel economy of the new car is better in the future. Yeah, that's all the measure in Thailand I would like to share. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jacobon. Appreciate that. Nicola, was there anything else that caught your eye, or was there anybody else from Group 1 who wants to share how the exercise was for them?
Thank you very much. Nothing really specific caught my eye. I really appreciate all your inputs, very useful. At the beginning, we also like a brief discussion that Adisa from Thailand, she also mentioned that she's unclear about the kind of methodologies for adaptation for adaptation strategies. So I think that's kind of a common issue for many countries, and in general, that we aren't really sure about what kind of adaptation strategies or methodologies we have for adaptation, and how to plan. So like also like planning long term and including adaptation strategies for transport and any other sectors in LTSs is very difficult if you don't know what kind of options we have, what kind of methodologies we can use, and I think that's something we should further continue working on, to provide resources, to provide such overview of methodologies. Yeah.
Thanks, Nicola.
Yeah, and I just want to hop in there to Nicola and Adisa's point about adaptation. Our team, not Howard and Logan, but other parts of our team will be starting a training. Although it's focused on Latin American countries, it's in response to an interest in understanding how to integrate climate impact, risks, and then opportunities for adaptation and for resilience. It's more broad than just dealing with transport, but certainly that's something else that we're thinking of. And as information comes out of that session, we can certainly make that publicly available. We'll post it on our T-LTS website, and we can certainly follow up with anyone who is interested. But this is good input for understanding kind of what the needs are and what we can explore further in our work. Logan, is there anything else from group 1 before we switch over to group 2?
I think that's a pretty decent recap, so feel free to pass it on to group 2.
All right, Nael and Howard, you have the microphone. Any updates from group 2 that you'd like to share?
Sure. Yeah. So I think some of the common findings that we found out of group 2 and we discussed in a bit of detail was one, developing methodologies for monitoring and evaluation, particularly as it relates to projects that might be underway. Avantika was speaking to that at the city level projects that were occurring and having the follow through and monitoring of those projects. It was a couple of other common points were made regarding having common data and methodologies and making sure those are carried through. And then a few people also mentioned kind of implicitly institutional arrangements as they particularly relate to electric vehicles, where implementation might be occurring at the provincial and city level versus in direction coming down from the national level for those policies. So that was also a common point. I think in general, the prioritization wise, I think folks generally thought most improvements were important or high importance. And I think there was a varying level of costs depending on the particular improvement category. Yeah, Niall, anything else you would add to that?
I think the only thing that I think that's a very good summary. The only thing that I would add is that several people identified very low cost but high importance actions that relate to creating interagency communication procedures and updating resilience and disaster management plans and things like that. So everything that is communication, data sharing, updating plans, those technically and should have low cost when compared to everything else, and those are really high importance. They can set the ground for everything else. So I think that was another good outcome from what I saw.
Great, thank you so much, Niall and Howard, and all of Group 2 for your thought and your efforts into going through this exercise. We have about 10 minutes left. Logan, do you mind just throwing up the last few slides? Because I do want to make sure we take some time to talk a little bit about the resources and just make a few closing remarks before we sign off and end our 4-part journey to LTS enlightenment, if you will. So the purpose of our training was to really raise awareness about this new concept of long-term strategies and the purpose that they serve in helping set low emission development priorities till 2050, as well as guiding the development of shorter term plans to make sure that you're on track to meet those visions. So when we talk about shorter term plans, it could be your sectoral plans or more broadly, the country's NDC. Through the last couple of sessions, we've been talking about identifying potential action items that you could take to advance LTS development. Even if you're not doing a full LTS, starting to lay the groundwork that allows you to move in that direction. So we do want to close today by highlighting some of the resources that might be available that could potentially support you or serve you moving forward. So slide, I think this is 32 in your deck, is just a highlight from one of the analysis that we did, interviews that we did through this project with a number of organizations to understand who is doing work related to LTS that might be relevant for some of you to access. There are a number of donors and organizations that are conducting different types of capacity building, developing different types of knowledge products that may be relevant to you. And this includes groups such as 2050's Pathways, GIZ, and I know there are a number of GIZ colleagues in our call, LEDS GP, which includes the Asia LEDS Partnership, and WRI and UNDP. So organizations you're probably quite familiar with. We've identified and cross-referenced with them some of the types of activities that they support. In addition, as you noted, highlighted at the top is USAID, and through our project, we're also providing technical support. So that is through these types of regional trainings, as well as bilateral support and developing knowledge products that can respond to the needs. So to Adisa's comment earlier about integrating adaptation, that's something that we can take into account into our programming for the coming year. I think, sorry, moving forward, Logan, just as a reminder about the resources that we have already shared with you, all our workshop materials, recordings, exercises, the class photo that we just took are all posted on Google Drive, and they'll remain there for you if you want to access that information. I also want to flag that's a document that's online. It's that specific scoping document that I just mentioned. So some of the outcomes of the interviews and the research that we conducted. This might be a helpful resource. It includes information about transparency, long-term strategies. It talks about which donors are working in which regions. It talks about which donors are doing which activities. And it includes a pretty comprehensive or a pretty good list of models that are being used and which countries are using them for which purpose. So some of those resources just might be helpful as you're thinking about it to complement the work that we've talked about. Following this workshop, so in addition to the resources following the workshop, we'll be conducting another survey. It'll be short. We'll try to keep it to 5 to 10 minutes of your time, just so that we can get some input from you about what would be helpful for you now that you've done this training. Also, this is our first time conducting this training, but in a weird way, we're also conducting this training in this format, which is virtual for 4 sessions over 2 weeks. So we welcome your input on whether this format is helpful for you or whether you have any suggestions for what we should consider changing in the future. This is new, and we certainly appreciate your patience as we tried this out. All right. And then just jumping forward, we have additional resources, a few more documents that might be helpful for you to look through that are from some of the organizations that I had mentioned. So these are the resources that we used and that we referenced to develop this training, and that might be helpful for you. And finally, I do want to take some time to just say thank you from our entire team for your interest and for joining this workshop. Many of you have come for the full 2 weeks and certainly have been very great to talk with you and hear from you. And I hope you walk away with something useful. In addition to thanking all the participants, I do want to highlight and thank a few of the folks that have joined that have been helping us in the background with organizing this. So that includes, of course, Nicola from SlowCat for joining us in session 2 and participating today, as well as Sumya and the group and the team at ALP who helped us with outreach and providing some input and organizing some of this. So a big thank you to others in the community who've made this happen. And finally, a big part of, hi Sumya, thank you. Finally, a big part of all of our, if we were doing this in training, a big part of this on top of learning is building out all of our climate transportation community, right? Building our networks so that we can turn to each other to learn from Jakapong's experience in Thailand with the excise tax, or Abdur's experience with data shortages. So I would say I've included our team's contact information, so our emails as well as our LinkedIn's. Please reach out. Please feel free to connect with us. We'd love to include you in our network and be part of yours. And we encourage all of you to also connect with each other so that we can build this new community of practice and engage. And certainly I might just open it up for Sumya to speak a little bit about ALP, because that's another really great community to connect with and to learn from and kind of get access to resources to advance our goals. Sumya, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, thank you so much, Irina. Pardon the noise in the background. The ALP always stands by. We work with a few folks who are on this workshop already. We stand by to provide technical resources, knowledge material, and to take some of the cases, good cases also that we have heard. For example, maybe the Thailand case is something that we would maybe put in resources to develop a case around it and then share it with the rest of the countries as well. So that is what the ALP, that is the raison d'etre, if I may say so, of the ALP, that we capture knowledge and we disseminate this to other countries and other practitioners who are interested in that, and also provide short-term technical assistance on topics, whether it is to do with stakeholder engagement or looking at roadmaps of, for example, if a country is looking to do fuel shifts or increase fuel efficiency, things like that. The ALP is also able to provide short-term technical assistance. So I stop there, and please feel free to reach out. Maybe I'll request Erin also to send out our email ID when she sends out material from the workshop, so you can get in touch with us as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sumya. All right, and then we have just 3 minutes. Any last comments, questions, things that anyone wants to flag before we close out for today?
Hi, Derina.
Hi, Gopal.
Yes, so on behalf of myself and on behalf of all the participants, I would like to thank you organizers to putting up this really, really useful and very good training sessions. And we particularly for me, I find it very new and very useful because most of the us are more focusing on NTCs and other periodic plans, but we are not giving much attention about these long-term goals, which can be served as a foundation or anchorage for these periodic and short-term plans. So this training has helped me to broaden my knowledge and skill set, so that if anybody comes to me asking about the support for this LTS, now I'm in better position to support or to guide towards the relevant resources and the agencies who supports on the LTS. But definitely for me, it's a totally new, and I'll definitely learn the new things through these courses. And I would like to thank once again for all of you for your wonderful effort and your wonderful training programs. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Gopal. That was lovely. All right, great. Anyone else? Nick, is there anything else you want to say from SLOCAT, for example? We've lost him, I think.
Yes, thank you very much for this great workshop and for this very great exercise that made many people, I think, participate and to evaluate what they are planning, what they are doing in terms of long-term strategies and in general in terms of climate action. So very great to be part of it. Thank you. And we look forward to working in the future on new and other activities with you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So on that note, so positive, I feel wonderful about this. It's a great way to end my day and hopefully a great way to start your day. So thank you very much. I hope you have a great day. Please do not hesitate to reach out if you have any questions following this. If you have any requests for assistance, we can certainly try to help make those connections. But thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
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 Goodbye.